It's another Football Friday on this chilly Friday afternoon in Oklahoma City. I'm Darnell Mayberry, your host, here with Jenny Carlson, columnist, Oklahoma State writer Kyle Fredrickson, and joined by phone from Arlington, Texas, where he's getting ready for OU Texas, Ryan Aber, our OU writer. Guys, it is OU Texas week. OU's favored by, I believe, 10.5, 11 points, something around that. Is this the year, Jenny, we'll start with you, is this the year that OU breaks out of its Texas malaise?
Well, it would definitely be a good time. I mean, for the most part of Bob Stoops' tenure as the OU coach, Oklahoma has played really well in this game. When they've been favored, they've won. When they've been maybe the underdog, they've still played Texas tight. Until the last 3 years, we've seen them as double-digit favorites, as you mentioned, Darnell, as they are in this game. And we've seen them only win one of those 3 games and, really have to get through by the skin of their teeth in the one that they did win. They've been out-muscled, they've been out-manned, they've been outplayed, out-coached. You want all of those adjectives you want to throw out. So this is a year where obviously Oklahoma is struggling at 2-2, as is Texas coming into this game. If Oklahoma wants to win this, maybe get sort of back on track to be a Big 12 title contender, they've got to play better because Texas, obviously, for all the things that Charlie Strong has not done at Texas, one of the things that he has been able to do is get his guys ready to go for this game.
Yeah. Ryan, they've struggled with Texas over the last 3 years. Why have they struggled, and what needs to change Saturday morning? Ryan, can you hear us?
Yeah, now I can.
Okay, the question is, they've struggled with Texas over the last 3 years. Why have they struggled so much with Texas over that span, and what needs to change Saturday morning?
Well, I think the big thing that needs to change is they just need to come out and play better. They've struggled because they've come out flat. They seem to have taken Texas lightly, a Texas team that has really struggled coming into this game for each of the last 3 years. That's got to change. They've got to get serious about this game, and it's the same situation this year. Texas is really struggling. They're down. There's a lot of speculation about their coach's future. You would hope that they would get things turned around because they know what happens when they don't in this game.
Ryan, the point spread seems a little high. What gives you confidence going into tomorrow's game that OU can actually get this one done?
Well, I picked them to win by 2, so I'm not sure about that point spread being, 11.5, I think is the latest that I've seen. It seems pretty ridiculous. Based on what we've seen out of the recent past. I think what makes me a little bit confident in OU in this game is the fact that they at least play a little bit of defense, not much. Texas hadn't played much defense at all. I mean, you look at their tackling issues, which we're going to write about in tomorrow's Oklahoman, and all of the problems that they've had on defense. Charlie Strong taking over as defensive coordinator after Vance Bedford was demoted earlier this week. I think that it's going to be a high-scoring game, but I would bet on OU's defense more than I would Texas's defense at this point.
Yeah, I got a chance, to see that Texas defense last week, as did Kyle, up in Stillwater. And it's really kind of shocking to see how poorly they are tackling right now, especially in their secondary. I mean, we saw guys from all positions bouncing off Cowboys last week in Stillwater, but it really is that secondary. They've got, Malik Jefferson is kind of the singular star of this defense, and we didn't hear his name called much last week, so he's not really in a position right now, at least, the way this defense is structured, for him to be making a lot of plays. It's coming down to guys that maybe aren't as high profile or as talented, and they're just not necessarily getting it done. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, can Texas tackle better, and how is Oklahoma's defense going to handle the Texas running game? Chris Warren is out. He's out indefinitely. Huge running back, and I mean huge. He made Shane Buechele in the backfield look like a child. He's just a gigantic human being. He's out with injury, but Donta Foreman is there. He'll be playing. If they put in Tyrone Swoops, he's a much bigger runner, physical runner. How does Oklahoma's front handle that, especially with that linebacking core that has been, again, decimated this week by another injury, that being Tay Evans, lost, leaving football because of concussions.
My question, Ryan, is the secondary. I mean, those are all good points, but my question is the secondary, Ryan. I mean, is this Sooner secondary ready to face Texas's offense?
Well, it's going to be really difficult for them until they get that other cornerback spot cemented, until they get somebody back there who can at least give you some kind of defense on that other side opposite Jordan Thomas, it's going to be a struggle. I think the good thing is Texas does have wide receivers, but they don't have that big, deep play guy that can burn you pretty consistently on that side of the ball. But they're going to have to get creative defensively in this game because of their problems at the cornerback spot, and also because of their problems in the past, at least, at defending quarterbacks like Tyrone Swoops. You've got to think that Texas would have some stuff drawn up, maybe for Swoops to throw the ball, which is something that we haven't seen much of this year because of all the issues that OU has had defensively, that Texas could do some different things against them. That's going to be a concern going into this one.
I'm really not sure why Texas hasn't thrown with Tyrone Swoops more out of that package. He's obviously running is his strong suit, but he's been their starting quarterback before. He's passed the ball before. We saw
let's remember he threw for almost 350 yards against OU just a couple years ago.
Right, and that's the thing. That sort of disappeared. When he comes in the game, they've almost exclusively used him to run the ball, which everybody knows if he's in there and all he's doing is running, defense can become, pretty short-sighted in that. So maybe they open it up with Tyrone Swoops. I don't know why they wouldn't, because Ryan brings up a great point. He's had some success against Oklahoma.
Yeah, Kyle, we're going to get you in here in just a second. You are not just here for your pretty face, I promise.
Hey, either way,
we're going to talk Oklahoma State in a second, but let's stick with Texas. We talked about a little bit of the defensive issues, and that's become a problem for Texas, particularly for head coach Charlie Strong. He's on the hot seat down in Austin, and maybe this could be his final OU Texas game. Ryan, let's go to you. Could this be Charlie Strong's final OU Texas game?
Yeah, I think it's very probable that this is his final OU Texas game based on what we've heard of Boston. It doesn't seem like they're going to fire him during the middle of the season, but to have the kind of struggles that they've had to this point and have to make the changes on his coaching staff that he has to this point for the second consecutive year. Last year was offense, this year it's defense. I think at some point it's his head on the chopping block, and it seems like right now, unless they just completely turn it around and are able to contend in the Big 12, this is likely to be Charlie Strong's last year. And not only because of Strong struggles, but the fact that Tom Herman right down the road has been mentioned for this job a ton, is likely to be available after this season, whether it's by Texas, LSU, or possibly even USC, where he's had some ties before. I think Texas is going to want to get in on the Tom Herman sweepstakes, and it's going to be really easy to unless they really turn it around this season.
Jenny, you wrote about Charlie Strong this week in a column for the Oklahoman. You mentioned a lot of examples, cited a lot of reasons why he is on the hot seat, struggles that they've had as a staff. Would this be a good move, the right move for Texas, and is this the right time?
Well, and that's a great question. I think Ryan brought up a great point about Tom Herman, and I don't think there's any doubt that Texas, there's a faction, and maybe a big faction of Texas fans that would love to see how Tom Herman would do in Austin. He's obviously recruited the state of Texas well, built Houston into something of a power pretty quickly, really. How would he do recruiting with the Longhorn on his shirt instead of the Cougar at Houston? They have gone back and forth, though, between having an offensive coach come in, bringing in a defensive coach. We've seen that. They've sort of gone back and forth. Strong was brought in to bring the defense, to really overhaul that had become such a weak spot. Well, now that's struggling. It looks like they want to maybe go back to offense and boost the offense. So, I think it's worth mentioning, and you and I had a conversation about this after I wrote about Charlie Strong. It's worth mentioning that he took over a bad situation. I mean, he took over a team that was struggling under Mack Brown in those last few years. Pretty clearly, they did not have the talent, the difference makers that Texas teams of previous years had. They just didn't have those guys at those skill positions to go out and make plays on a consistent basis. They haven't really had a quarterback at Texas since Colt McCoy, which is still unbelievable for me to believe. Now, Shane Buechele may be that guy.
He's a good one.
He's a good one, and only a true freshman. So he may change that, but to still be at Texas and think they've gone all these years, Colt McCoy is an old man at this point. And in football terms, they really haven't had a great distinguishable quarterback since Colt McCoy. That's really surprising.
Last question on this topic, Ryan, and we'll get to Oklahoma State. Last year, the win against OU helped probably save Charlie Strong's job. Could this happen again this year for Charlie Strong in Texas? Could a win against the Sooners help save his job?
I think it would be a step, but I think they would have to contend for the Big 12 and possibly win the Big 12 to save Charlie Strong's job. I don't know that just a win in this game is enough. As successful as he's been in this series and how much he's struggled outside of this series, Texas fans, boosters, the people with money down there certainly want more than what Charlie Strong's given them to this point, and I don't think that changes based on Saturday.
Yeah, I think if Oklahoma was better this season, if Oklahoma's undefeated and, ranked really high, which if they were undefeated, they probably would be ranked really high, maybe a win, even if Texas stumbles a little more down the stretch, might save Charlie, but you're talking about two teams that are right now. So, a win against Oklahoma, while obviously you want if you're the Texas coach, to me it's not definitive in his future with the Longhorns.
You've got some people in this state that put all their marbles in the win against OU, and I'm looking up north in Payne County as we transition to Stillwater. I'm talking about Boone Pickens and his love for beating OU. Kyle, let's talk a little bit about Oklahoma State. Mike Yurcich, the offensive coordinator, I hope I pronounced his name.
Got it.
He doesn't believe in trap games, he says. Do you believe in trap games, and is this Iowa State game a trap game?
Well, I think the fan base, every year looks at the Iowa State game and thinks, uh-oh, here's our trap game because of what happened in 2011. And it's a scrappy team that, year after year, similar in OSU in terms of they have some disadvantages in recruiting. They're not in an idyllic place to live necessarily. So they get a lot of 2- and 3-star guys to load up that roster. And on any given night, those guys can make plays as we saw in 2011. In terms of this game, though, I'm going to kind of agree with Yurcich. I'm just not sure that Iowa State fields the type of talent that kind of creates a trap game. We saw what happened in Baylor, last week, the way that the Cyclones were really able to rush the ball against the Bears, but that should come as no surprise. That's a really huge deficit of that Baylor program. So certainly the Cowboys can't sleep this week and thinking that they're going to get an easy victory. But when you look at sort of the building blocks of each program, the way OSU has really run the ball lately, the way that Iowa State's allowed the run, I see this one being a pretty clear-cut Cowboy victory. The spread being around 17 points, I think that's about right.
It seems like Ames has become something of a kryptonite for Oklahoma State. They go up there last year with a team that was on a winning streak, and they escaped by the skin of their teeth. And Joel Lanning, the run-first quarterback for Iowa State now, who's managing some of that quarterback run game, that was really his coming out, was against Oklahoma State. It took a great effort by Oklahoma State, the defense, to salvage that win up there in Ames. So I'm not saying that Iowa State won't be able to score some points in Stillwater on Saturday. I think they will, but I do think that this matchup lends itself a little bit more to Oklahoma State than maybe even Baylor did last week for exactly the reasons you said, Kyle. That Baylor defense just really soft up the middle. Run game, they're really prone to give up some running yards, as we saw with Oklahoma State and then last week with Iowa State.
Yeah, and Kyle, Oklahoma State, as you know, is dealing with some injuries. A lot of guys dinged up, maybe even out. How are they going to compensate for the losses that they've had, and who could potentially benefit Saturday?
Well, they've talked about depth all year long with this group, something they needed late last year into October and November, and something they didn't have a whole lot of, and the Cowboys lost 3 straight games. But yeah, you mentioned some of the depth issues this time around. You got a guy in James Washington who was knocked out cold last week. Mike Gundy says he's, quote, fine, but it's hard to say whether or not that's going to be the case when he actually lines up. Jordan Burton's probable at that star linebacker position, and that sort of leads us into one guy to keep an eye on. Calvin Bundage, the local product, Edmond Santa Fe, 6'2", really rangy. He only has 7 tackles on the season, but as a true freshman has stepped into a position he's never played before, has been able to really excel and show off some of that athleticism. There's been moments where he's been in the wrong spot, but it's to be expected. So a guy like him is opt to have a pretty strong showing. And I also look on offense to have Keenan Brown maybe have more of a role in the offense come Saturday.
Backs.
The Cowboy backs, Brown being the converted receiver, had 1 catch for 38 yards last week and made his first career start. So I think as we see some of the attrition start to happen, the Cowboys leaning on some of those playmakers we've heard about but really haven't seen through 5 or 6 games.
Ryan Aber, what are you doing? Did you find the Congo line or something? What is going on?
There was a drum guy as we were walking to the stadium here in Arlington.
Ryan Aber, by the way, going to the Rangers playoff game today.
You're supposed to be working. What is this, a day off?
What a tough life.
Jeez.
Hey, I've got my work done for the day, for the most part.
For the most part.
Now he's conga lining all the way to Arlington.
Well, mute your microphone next time you run into a drummer.
Baseball game, right?
Enjoy the game, Ryan. Let's stick with Oklahoma State for a second. Guys, this is a defense in Iowa State that's not very good. And 22 missed tackles, I believe, against Texas. I'm sorry, last week for Iowa State against Baylor. Oklahoma State benefited from some missed tackles against Texas last week. How do you see that working in Oklahoma State's favor this week?
Well, this just seems like another great game to establish Justice Hill as your running back. 25 carries last week in the win against Texas. That's a pretty big building block for a guy who's playing his, third or fourth college game getting into the season. So I think as the Cowboys give him more reps, get him more comfortable, it's going to do wonders for the rest of this offense. This is an offense that hasn't had a consistent 100-yard rusher since 2012, and now for the first time we've seen 3 consecutive games where they get 100 yards on the ground. So I think the Cowboys are going to be set in their run game. Iowa State giving up 261 yards a game on the ground so far, a 200 and 100-yard rusher against Baylor last week. So if they're able to establish that, continue to let Mason Rudolph kind of develop his intermediate passing game, we know he can complete the deep ball. This seems like a game where the Cowboys can really rep what they do in practice and do it well in a game environment against a less than stellar defense, albeit the team from Ames always provides a tough challenge for these Cowboys. But this seems like a game where they should be able to thrive and really help usher Hill into a role where he feels comfortable with that number of carries.
I wonder that I agree about the running success. I think OSU will have success running the ball. My only question would be is if you're Oklahoma State and you've got a true freshman that looks like your running back of not only the future but the here and now, and you're saying 20 carries, 25 carries, is there any concern that he's going to hit a wall? He seems like a guy who's maintained a really strong presence out there even late in games. So far the returns have been good on that, but against an Iowa State team that seems susceptible to the run, do you mix it a little bit more? Do you get more touches to Rennie Childs? We hear Chris Carson is maybe approaching return. I doubt it's
probably
this
not
week.
this week, but fairly certainly in the next few weeks he'll probably be back.
So maybe it's a little more Rennie Childs, maybe it's a little more Barry J. Sanders than you would normally see. Now, if it doesn't work, if those guys aren't getting the yards, then you go back to Justice Hill. I mean, I think you go with what you know and give that guy the ball because he's clearly continued to show himself capable. But I think that might be something Oklahoma State will look at just to not get to the point where they get we are midway through the year, get into November and they realize, oh my gosh, Justice Hill's running down a little bit.
Yeah, quick update for us, Kyle. What's the status and the latest on James Washington?
Mike Gundy says that he's fine, basically, is what he said in his press conference on Monday. I assume that OSU went through all of its concussion protocols in the game against Baylor. Gundy said it was more precautionary than anything, keeping Washington out of that game. They think he could have played if they needed him. But in this situation, even with all the concussion news we've heard at OU and some of this going on, James Washington, a guy who, at least from what we know, doesn't really have a big history in concussions. If this is a first-time incident for him, I have no really reason to doubt Gundy in saying that he's ready to go this week.
I think we talked after the game, you and I, last week, about the fact that sometimes those concussion symptoms don't always present right away. So he did get knocked out cold from what we were told. So you have to wonder if, maybe he's feeling okay at that moment, but in half hour, an hour, 2 hours, as we saw last year with Baker Mayfield when he took that hit to the back of his head in the TCU game, he continued to play, was checking out. They were asking him all the concussion protocol questions, continued to play in the first half, then went to the locker room and developed a headache, and then they pulled him out of the game. So you just never know how these things are going to evolve. And, I just think in a situation like that, caution is the best policy because you don't want to mess around with this stuff.
Yeah. You're watching Football Friday with our college football coverage crew, Jenny Carlson, Kyle Fredrickson, and joined by phone by Ryan Aber. We're talking OU Texas and Oklahoma State, Iowa State. Guys, let's switch gears back to OU. Sooners great, the Boz, Brian Bosworth, made headlines this week when he said that maybe OU needs a change. Maybe it's time for Bob Stoops to go. He wasn't particularly pleased with Bob Stoops' bowl record and the performance of the Sooners in some big-time games. Ryan, let's go to you. Does Brian Bosworth have a point? Is it time for Bob Stoops to go? Or is Brian Bosworth off his rocker a little bit?
Well, I think there's a little bit of both there. I think there's certainly an element of truth that not only Brian Bosworth, but plenty of other people associated with this program are sort of sick of the recent bowl results. I think he said 7 or 8 years. I don't think it's been that long, but certainly the last three bowl losses have been crushing to this program. To lose in the fashion that they did, getting blown out by Texas A&M and by Clemson twice, that's sort of knocked this program a little bit back on its heels. And there's some thought that Bob Stoops it may be just time for him to move on. And certainly Brian Bosworth made that point pretty strongly yesterday on his program, on Jason Whitlock's program on FS1.
Jenny, what was your reaction to his comments?
Well, I think he, sort of as Ryan alluded to, I think he said some of the things that a lot of Sooner fans are thinking and feeling about Bob Stoops. Not all, but definitely some are frustrated by the fact that when Oklahoma plays really good opponents from other conferences, they don't always show well. Not necessarily that they would win or lose, but that they wouldn't really look all that competitive in some of these instances. So I think that does get under a lot of skin in that Sooner fan base. But, you know, I'm of the belief that Oklahoma could look around at a lot of coaches and make a change and end up in a much worse place than they are with Bob Stoops. I mean, let's remember, this team's in the college football playoff less than a year ago. You know, they're a step away from the national championship game. Now, granted, it didn't happen against Clemson, but they're in that game against Clemson until the fourth quarter. I mean, the score at the end felt bigger than that, but they were really in that game until into the second half. So I think there's a little bit of altered thinking when it comes to some of this stuff with Sooner fans and apparently Sooner legends even. So, you know, I think, again, I go back to the feeling that Oklahoma could do a lot worse. I know people will say, well, go get Nick Saban, go get Tom Herman. Go get Urban Meyer. I understand you have a big belief in your program, but you're not going to go get most of those guys. Maybe you're in play for Tom Herman, but you're not getting Urban Meyer. You're not getting Nick Saban. So then who are you getting? You getting somebody else that's been cast off from their previous job? Or are you going to go, who are you going to find? I mean, I just think you're looking at guys that aren't maybe as good as Bob Stoops taking over that job. Or you're hiring somebody that's a little more unproven. And that becomes a risk in and of itself.
Ryan, does this boil down basically to one or two disappointing performances a year? I mean, and this is OU football. I mean, the expectation is through the roof. But does it really boil down to just one or two performances a year that really have people upset, frustrated, and want to see a change?
I'm sorry, Darnell. I can't hear that.
The Congo line strikes again.
No, go ahead. I can hear that perfectly.
Okay, all right. So what I'm asking is does this boil down to just one or two poor performances per year that people are frustrated with, Sooner fan base, and is that why people want to see change?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about it that people are fired up that this program, in their mind, has slipped behind Alabama and Ohio State and others nationally, where the perception is, I think, that this program is in a worse position than maybe it was during the totality of the Barry Switzer era, when people forget, the downs and dips of that time during Oklahoma football. Clearly, that hasn't happened this time. Bob Stoops has kept them in bowl games. They've won consistently. The problem has been the performances in bowl games and the performances in getting blown out in those games. And like Jenny said, a lot of it is the perception of that. They were in the game against Clemson last year until the second half. They were, in a couple of those other bowl games, but they turn into blowouts by the end. And it leads to people at least thinking that those were embarrassing losses, and they were in a lot of ways.
Guys, let's switch gears a little bit to a topic that won't go away and doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon, and that's concussions. Recently, 3 Sooners have go Rangers.
Cheering.
Not a great time to cheer. But.
Three Sooners have retired from football due to concussions. Daniel Brooks, the news coming on him, senior running back from OU, being the latest. The NCAA, I mean, from the NFL to the NCAA high schools, at every level, administrators are trying to do something to curtail this problem. Doesn't seem to be working. We're seeing more and more athletes retire early due to concussion concerns. Guys, what can be done? Where are we in terms of being able to alleviate this problem? How do you see this going forward?
Yeah, well, to me, even though the number of guys retiring is, college guys retiring is a little bit jarring. I mean, like you say, 3 OU players this season. a Kansas player, and that's 2 for them in the last 2 years. Or earlier this week, the news came about that. Excuse me. While that's disturbing to me, if these guys are having situations where they're getting to this point, if they weren't retiring, that would be even worse in my mind. Because if it's just accepted, okay, this is just part of it, this is how it's going to be, just go on down the road, and we don't hear about Jamal Danley retiring, we don't hear about Tay Evans or Daniel Brooks or any of these other guys that have retired from the college level, and they're just allowed to play, to me that's even more worrisome. And to me it at least signals that schools, players are at least mindful of what this can be and how serious and dangerous it really is that these guys are getting this information and making educated decisions for the betterment of their health long term. And it's got to be a tough decision. I have zero doubt about that.
And it's got to be a culture change.
Right.
We teach athletes from a young age, if you're injured, well, don't worry about it, tough it out. But I think we've gotten to the point now where the message is, if it's a head injury, you don't mess with it. It's not something that you're going to just kind of brush off and power through. And it was interesting, in April, I went to a concussions conference in Tulsa, and I talked to Valjean Ivan, OSU's head physician, about the difficulty of identifying concussions, about how people on TV often have a better view of potential head injuries than even the athletic staff who was in charge of preventing them at these games, the medical staff. They'll put a guy up in the press box, there's people on the sideline, but without some of those instant replays, some Joe Schmo sitting at home might have a better opportunity of identifying these things happening. So there's so many different levels to this. It's really a fascinating subject, but like I said earlier, it starts with a culture change of these guys identifying their injuries. And like Jenny said, this might be progress to see so many guys say, all right, hey, I'm done, without maybe necessarily addressing why it's happening.
Ryan, as we mentioned, 3 guys from OU have recently retired because of these concerns. What is head coach Bob Stoops talking about when it comes to this topic, and the administrators? What are they saying about these retirements due to concussion concerns?
Well, I think the big thing that they're saying is that they're trusting the doctors. They're trusting Scott Anderson, Brock Schnabel, and Anderson has been sort of at the forefront of concussion research over the last decade or so. And they're just having to blindly trust what they say. If they say a kid isn't able to go, isn't able to continue both in the game, season, or career, they're taking that as a gospel. And I wonder if we're going to see an explosion of these kinds of retirements over the next few years as more and more schools get people who are completely bought in that head injuries are an incredibly serious problem and that you've got to protect future life, future productivity over a football career.
Yeah, one thing I'll say, my last word on this, we've seen the targeting penalty come into college football, put a big penalty on the players that target, that hit guys in the wrong way. And I think it has helped. But to me, these guys at OU are a reminder. Now, we saw the James Washington hit. While it wasn't targeting, it was definitely looked at and reviewed, should it have been. But these guys from OU, to our knowledge, were not in game situations where they were the victim of a targeting penalty. So I think it's worth remembering that it's not just big single hits that cause these concussions. Repeated head trauma, essentially. These guys repeatedly hitting somebody else in practice can cause this. So to me, that's just another sort of changing of the culture, remembering how these things can happen.
Thanks, guys. It's an issue that's really not going away anytime
Nope.
soon. It's something to watch going forward. That's all for Football Friday. Thanks for joining us. For our complete coverage of OU Texas and Oklahoma State, Iowa State, be sure to read The Oklahoman and stay with us right here at newsok.com.